The chainsaw ripped through 250 years of history before I even got home. The sound, I imagine, must have been deafening, a visceral scream of ancient wood fibers being torn apart. Brenda, the self-proclaimed monarch of the Oak Knoll Homeowners Association, didn't just trespass onto my property. She orchestrated an execution. When I finally arrived, pulling into the driveway with a stomach full of lead, I found her standing amidst the carnage of my ancestral coastal redwood. The air, usually clean and crisp, was thick with the scent of fresh sawdust and diesel fumes. And she was laughing. She was laughing because a few stray needles had dared to violate the sanctity of her chemically sterilized, unnaturally green lawn. "See, Mark," she sneered, kicking the massive stump, easily 10 feet across, like it was a piece of driftwood she found offensive. "I told you I handle problems decisively. Your eyesore is finally gone. The neighborhood is cleaner, safer, and frankly more valuable now." She gestured vaguely with a perfectly manicured hand. "I'll be sure to send you the invoice for the removal first thing Monday morning." She genuinely believed she had just taken down an inconvenient piece of landscaping. She operated under the delusion that the worst I could do, the absolute extent of my recourse, was to file a complaint with the very HOA board she controlled like a puppet master. What Brenda didn't realize, in her infinite arrogance and staggering ignorance, was that the tree she had just butchered wasn't just old. It was a designated heritage tree, a living historical landmark protected by some of the most stringent environmental laws in the state. And she certainly didn't know that the penalty for destroying it wasn't a slap on the wrist fine from the county. It wasn't a few $1,000s. When the process server handed her the lawsuit demanding $1.5 million in damages, the smug satisfaction evaporated instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a mask of sheer terror. And her meticulously curated, beige world didn't just crack, it imploded. Welcome back to Keys and Chaos. The stories we feature on this channel are about what happens when unchecked entitlement collides head-on with catastrophic consequences. Before we dive into the meticulous details of how Brenda's life completely fell apart, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? And have you ever had a neighbor who genuinely believed they owned the entire street? Let me know down in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story, because the journey to that $1.5 million figure is a masterclass in karma you absolutely won't want to miss. My name is Mark. The house I live in isn't just stucco and drywall. It's not just an address in a gated community. It's a legacy. My great-grandparents bought this plot of land back in the early 1900s, long before this valley was swallowed by the relentless march of suburban sprawl, long before the toxic concept of an HOA even existed here. It was a place where people respected boundaries, not because of a covenant enforced by fines, but because of basic human decency and mutual respect. But the real centerpiece of the property, the soul of the land, the anchor of our family history, wasn't the house. It was the giant in the backyard. It was a coastal redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. It stood over 150 feet tall, a magnificent spire of green against the often foggy sky. It was ancient, estimated by experts to be well over 250 years old. That tree had stood firm through droughts, wildfires, earthquakes, and the relentless pressure of development. It was a sentinel, a silent witness to generations of my family, births, deaths, celebrations, and quiet moments of reflection. I grew up climbing its lower branches, reading books in its immense, cool shade, and watching the sunlight filter through its upper canopy. That tree was everything. It was the heart of the property, and it was the precise reason Brenda despised me from the moment her moving truck blocked the street. To fully grasp the gravity of what Brenda did, you have to understand what that redwood represented.
It wasn't merely a source of oxygen and shade. It was living, breathing history, a connection to a wilder, more profound time. When my great-grandparents first settled here, the area was characterized by rolling hills, orchards, and open space. They chose this specific plot because of the redwood. It was already a massive dominating feature of the landscape back then. They built the house slightly to the east of it, ensuring the tree was the focal point, the protector of the homestead. There are sepia-toned photographs in my hallway of my grandfather as a toddler, absolutely dwarfed by the base of the trunk, his small hand resting on the thick, fibrous bark. As the decades rolled by, the city expanded, creeping closer and closer. The orchards were plowed under, the open spaces carved up, replaced by tract housing, strip malls, and the gray monotony of asphalt. Our property remained an oasis, a holdout, a stubborn refusal to yield to the homogenization of the landscape. When the developers came knocking in the 1980s, blueprints in hand for the gated community that now surrounds us, they realized they had a significant obstacle: my family's property, and specifically, the redwood. They couldn't just take it. Eminent domain had its limits, especially when dealing with a tree that predated the state constitution itself. So they negotiated. They pleaded. My parents, wanting to be reasonable neighbors but unwilling to sacrifice their heritage, agreed to incorporate our property into the new development, and subsequently the HOA, under one ironclad, non-negotiable condition. The redwood was to be protected in perpetuity. It wasn't just a handshake deal or a vague agreement. My father, an incredibly meticulous and forward-thinking man, went much further. He understood that memory fades and new residents arrive ignorant of the past. He had the tree officially surveyed by the county, appraised by specialists, and registered as a heritage tree. This designation was not merely honorary. It meant that you couldn't so much as trim a major branch without a specialized permit, a public hearing, and a comprehensive environmental impact report. Cutting it down, that was unthinkable. It was legally classified essentially as an immovable historical landmark. This protection was written directly into the deed of our property and, crucially, embedded into the foundational bylaws of the Oak Knoll HOA itself. Article 14, Section 3, the legacy redwood on Plot 54 is exempt from all landscaping regulations and is recognized as a protected entity, immune from removal or alteration by the association. For the first 20 years, this arrangement worked perfectly. The neighbors appreciated the tree. It was unique. It gave our otherwise cookie-cutter neighborhood a sense of identity, a touch of character that the developers couldn't manufacture. Kids loved it. People used it as a landmark. Turn left when you see the giant redwood, they'd say. The HOA board, back then, was composed of reasonable, community-minded individuals. They were residents who volunteered their time to ensure the community pool was clean and the front gates functioned properly. They weren't power-hungry bureaucrats looking for an ego trip or a way to impose their will on others. They understood that living in a community meant compromise, coexistence, and respect for the history of the place they called home. We lived in peace. The tree stood tall, the seasons changed, my parents passed away, and I inherited the house, becoming the fourth generation to steward the redwood. I took that responsibility with the utmost seriousness. I had certified arborists check its health annually. I ensured the deep irrigation system was functioning perfectly during the dry summers. I maintained the property meticulously. While the tree was wild and grand, the rest of the yard was neat and compliant with the general spirit of the neighborhood. I genuinely believed the legal protections were enough. I thought the historical designation was an impenetrable shield. I operated under the assumption that basic respect for property rights and the established law of the land would prevail. I hadn't accounted for the arrival of someone who believed that rules applied only to others, and that her personal, sterile aesthetic preferences superseded centuries of history and the law. I hadn't accounted for Brenda. The neighborhood dynamic shifted noticeably about 5 years ago. The older, reasonable residents started moving out, heading to retirement communities or moving closer to their grandchildren. They were replaced by a new demographic, people obsessed with status, uniformity, and absolute control. People who bought houses not to live in them, but to curate them as if they were museum exhibits. And the epicenter of this new obsession moved in directly next door to mine.
Brenda moved in on a Tuesday. I remember it vividly because her caravan of moving trucks and luxury SUVs blocked the street for nearly 8 hours. When a neighbor politely asked if they could reposition one truck so he could get to work, she refused, citing that she was coordinating complex logistics. That should have been the first glaring red flag. Brenda wasn't just a new resident. She was a force of nature, the destructive, invasive species kind. She was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in designer clothes, with a haircut so sharp and angular it looked like it could cut glass. She possessed the kind of strained, artificial smile that never reached her eyes, and a voice that could curdle milk from 50 paces. Within a month of moving in, she began her campaign for control. She started attending every HOA meeting, armed with a binder full of complaints and suggestions. The color of the standardized mailboxes wasn't uniform enough. They needed a slightly different shade of beige. The seasonal decorations people put up were tacky and violated the aesthetic harmony. The sound of children playing in the community park during the afternoon was disruptive to the ambiance and should be restricted to certain hours. She viewed the HOA not as a community organization designed to manage common areas, but as a tool for enforcing her personal vision of perfection upon everyone else. And her vision was sterile, lifeless, and monochromatic. She aggressively advocated for replacing the natural grass in the common areas with high-end artificial turf because, as she stated in an open meeting, nature is inherently messy, and we strive for order. It didn't take long for her to consolidate power. The reasonable people remaining on the board didn't have the stomach for her constant aggression, her nitpicking, and her relentless negativity. One by one, they resigned, exhausted and demoralized. Brenda, utilizing proxies she collected from absentee owners and lobbying the other status-obsessed newcomers, maneuvered herself onto the board. Within a year of her arrival, she was the HOA president. The reign of terror began immediately. The volume of fines issued skyrocketed. She hired a private security firm to patrol the neighborhood, not looking for criminals or safety hazards, but for infractions of the bylaws. Trash cans left out 30 minutes past the 7:00 p.m. deadline, $100 fine. A single dandelion spotted in your flower bed, $150 violation notice and a demand for immediate remediation. Painting your front door an unapproved shade of beige, because even beige had approved shades, a cease and desist letter and the immediate threat of a lien on your property. The neighborhood became a parody of itself. It was pristine, yes, but it was also devoid of joy, personality, and life. People were genuinely afraid to use their own backyards for fear of violating some obscure rule about unauthorized patio furniture. And then, inevitably, Brenda turned her full attention to me, specifically to the Redwood. My property was the antithesis of everything she stood for. The Redwood was massive, ancient, and inherently uncontrollable. It was nature on a large scale, sitting defiantly right next to her temple of artificiality. Brenda had spent an absolute fortune on her backyard. She had ripped out the existing landscaping and installed a vast expanse of that unnatural, chemically treated lawn I mentioned earlier. It looked like a putting green on steroids, smelling faintly of fertilizer and pesticides. In the center, she built an elaborate rose garden filled with rare hybrid tea roses that required constant sunlight, meticulous care, and a shocking amount of water. The conflict started subtly. She would make passive-aggressive comments over the fence. "Must be nice not having to worry about all these dreadful needles," she'd say, holding up a single redwood needle between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a venomous snake. The redwood, being a living organism, did what trees do. It dropped needles. It provided shade. It attracted wildlife, birds, squirrels, the occasional owl. To me, this was the beauty of it, the ecosystem functioning as intended. To Brenda, it was an infestation. The needles were the primary offense. Despite the prevailing winds generally blowing away from her property, some needles would inevitably drift onto her pristine lawn. It wasn't a deluge, it was a dusting. But to Brenda, even a single needle was a declaration of war. Then there was the shade. The redwood, being 150 feet tall, cast a long shadow, particularly in the late afternoon. This shadow had the audacity to fall across a corner of her precious rose garden for about 2 hours a day. She claimed this was stunting the growth and inhibiting the blooming potential of her Mr. Lincoln roses. Finally, there were the birds. Brenda hated birds with a passion. She called them flying rodents. She complained incessantly that the redwood attracted them, and they had the nerve to occasionally relieve themselves on her imported Italian marble patio furniture. It was absurd. It was nature happening in a backyard. But Brenda didn't believe she should have to coexist with nature. She believed nature should bend to her will, or be eradicated. The complaints escalated from passive-aggressive comments to formal violation notices. I started receiving official letters from the HOA, Brenda's HOA, citing nuisance debris and failure to maintain landscaping in accordance with community standards. I contested every single one, meticulously documenting my responses. I pointed out Article 14, Section 3 of the bylaws. I reminded the board that the tree was exempt and protected by law. But Brenda, presiding over the hearings with a smug look of authority, would simply dismiss my arguments outright. Bylaws can be interpreted, she would say with a dismissive wave of her hand, and as president, I interpret that tree as a dangerous nuisance. She started fining me $500 a month. I refused to pay. She threatened to place a lien on my house and begin foreclosure proceedings. I contacted a lawyer who sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA's legal counsel reminding them that their actions were illegal, constituted targeted harassment, and would result in significant liability if they proceeded. They backed off on the lien, but the harassment only intensified. Brenda started lobbying the other residents, trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me and the tree. She claimed the roots were damaging the sewer lines and the community's foundation, which they weren't. The plumbing was nowhere near it. She claimed the branches were a fire hazard, which they weren't. The tree was healthy, irrigated, and regularly maintained. She painted me as the neighborhood pariah, the one selfish resident refusing to get with the program, the obstacle to their collective prosperity. The tension was palpable. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel her eyes on me, analyzing, judging, and plotting. I knew she wouldn't stop. I knew she saw this as a war of wills. And Brenda, I realized, was not accustomed to losing.
The situation finally came to a head in late September. The weather was starting to turn, the air was crisp, and the redwood was going through a seasonal needle shed. It was slightly heavier than usual, a natural cycle the tree went through every few years to prepare for the winter rains. I was in my front yard, clearing some leaves from the driveway, when Brenda stormed out of her house. She wasn't just angry, she was apoplectic. It was a level of rage that seemed entirely disproportionate to the situation. Her face was mottled red, her hands were shaking, and she was clutching an expensive-looking crystal vase. "Look at this! Look at what your filth did!" she shrieked, thrusting the vase in my face. Inside were perhaps a dozen redwood needles floating in murky water. "This was on my outdoor dining table. My $2,000 Italian silk tablecloth is ruined! Ruined by your negligence!" I tried to remain calm, to de-escalate the situation. "Brenda, it's a tree. It sheds. It's a natural process. I can't control the wind." "I don't care about the wind!" she screamed, loud enough for the neighbors 3 doors down to stop what they were doing and watch. "I care about my roses. I care about my property value. That monstrosity is destroying the aesthetic value of this entire neighborhood, and I've had enough!" "Brenda, we've been over this repeatedly," I said, keeping my voice steady and low, refusing to engage with her hysteria.
The redwood is 250 years old. It is entirely on my property, and more importantly, it is a registered heritage tree. It is protected by both county ordinances and state law. I literally cannot cut it down even if I wanted to, which I emphatically do not. This is where she lost it completely. She crossed the line from irrational neighbor to delusional dictator. "Don't you dare quote laws to me, you insignificant little man," she spat, the venom in her voice shocking me. "I am the president of the Oaknall HOA, and in this neighborhood, I am the law. I make the rules. The board is in full agreement, and I have decided that the tree must go. Period." I was stunned by the sheer audacity, the blatant disregard for reality. You don't have the authority to override state law, Brenda. You are not above the Constitution. "Watch me," she hissed, her eyes narrowed to slits. "I have the full support of the board. We have voted in a closed session. The tree will be removed. If you don't hire a crew to take it down by the end of the week, I will." "You will what?" I asked, incredulous, wondering if she actually understood the words coming out of her mouth. "I will hire a crew myself," she said, her voice dripping with malice, "and I will rip that thing out by the roots if I have to. And then I will send you the bill for the labor, and if you don't pay it immediately, I will foreclose on your house and finally get rid of you too." I looked her dead in the eye. I wanted her to understand the gravity of what she was threatening, the massive legal ramifications of her proposed actions. "Brenda, listen to me very carefully. That tree is legally protected. If you or anyone you hire steps 1 foot onto my property without my explicit permission, I will have you arrested for trespassing. If you touch that tree, you will be committing a felony, a serious felony. Do not test me on this." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "A felony? It's a piece of wood, Mark. Grow up. The police won't do anything. They know who I am in this town. They respect my authority." She stormed off, muttering threats about lawyers, injunctions, and emergency remediation. I didn't believe her. Not entirely. I thought it was bluster, the empty threats of a bully who had never faced real consequences. I thought even Brenda, with her vastly inflated sense of self-importance, wouldn't be stupid enough to commit a blatant felony over some needles and shade. The legal ramifications were astronomical. No rational person would take that risk. But I realized then that Brenda was not a rational person. She was driven by ego, entitlement, and an obsessive need for control. That evening, I took precautions. I upgraded my home security system. I installed additional high-definition cameras covering the entire backyard, specifically focused on the redwood and the property line. I made sure the footage was backing up directly to the cloud in real time, ensuring that even if the cameras were damaged, the evidence would be preserved. I also sent a detailed email to my lawyer summarizing the confrontation and Brenda's explicit threats, creating a clear paper trail. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, preparing for a siege. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had become toxic. Brenda was actively going door to door, spinning a narrative about how I was endangering the community with my unsafe and diseased tree, and how she was taking decisive action to protect their property values. She was convincing some people. The constant pressure to conform, the fear of being the next target of her wrath, it was wearing people down. They started looking at the redwood not as a majestic landmark, but as a liability, a source of conflict. I waited. The week passed, the deadline she had set came and went, the tree remained standing. I started to breathe a little easier. I thought perhaps my warnings had finally gotten through to her. I thought maybe she had consulted the HOA's legal counsel and they had told her how insane and dangerous her plan was. I was wrong. I had profoundly underestimated the depth of her entitlement and the extent of her malice. She wasn't backing down. She was just organizing the execution squad. 3 days later, I had to leave town for a business conference in San Francisco. It was a 2-day trip, unavoidable, and had been scheduled for months. I was nervous about leaving the property unattended, given the escalating tension, but I reasoned that Brenda wouldn't try anything while I was away. It seemed too brazen, too reckless, even for her. I left on a Thursday morning. I checked the security cameras obsessively on my phone throughout the day. Everything was quiet. The redwood stood pall, bathed in the autumn sunlight, a picture of tranquility. Friday afternoon, I was sitting in a seminar on market analysis, my mind drifting,
when my phone buzzed urgently in my pocket. It was an alert from my backyard security camera. Motion detected, significant activity. I swiped it open, expecting to see a squirrel or perhaps a deer wandering through the yard. What I saw instead made my blood run cold and my heart stop. It wasn't a squirrel. It was a crew of men in hard hats, carrying massive industrial-grade chainsaws, standing at the base of the redwood, and standing next to them, pointing up at the canopy, clipboard in hand, was Brenda. I panicked. My breath hitched. I jumped up from my seat, ignoring the speaker's confused look, and ran out of the conference room into the hallway. My hands were shaking as I tried calling Brenda. It went straight to voicemail. I tried calling the local police department, frantic, explaining that there was a crime in progress, a felony destruction of property. But I was put on hold by the non-emergency dispatcher, the agonizingly calm hold music contrasting sharply with the panic rising in my chest. I was helpless. I was 300 miles away watching a live stream of the destruction of my legacy, the murder of a giant. I watched as the men started their chainsaws. The sound, even through the tiny speaker of my phone, was deafening. It was a visceral, sickening sound, a high-pitched mechanical scream. They started with the lower branches, severing them with brutal efficiency. Limbs that were older than I was crashed to the ground, crushing the landscaping below. And then they started on the trunk. They were using a massive chainsaw with a blade that looked impossibly long. They began cutting a wedge into the base of the 250-year-old giant, the sawdust flying like blood spatter. It took them less than an hour. An hour to erase 2.5 centuries of growth. I watched, paralyzed with rage and a profound, agonizing grief as the redwood began to tilt. There was a cracking sound, a sound so loud and deep it seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. The sound of ancient fibers giving way, the death rattle of a monarch. And then the massive tree fell. It fell across my backyard, the impact shaking the ground with such force that it triggered the seismic sensor on my security system. It obliterated the fence, crushed the antique garden furniture, and carved a deep furrow into the earth. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of the chainsaws. The skyline was empty. The space where the redwood had stood for centuries, the anchor of the neighborhood, was now a gaping void. The light in the backyard was different, harsh, unfiltered, unnatural. I immediately booked the first flight home. The drive from the airport was a blur of adrenaline and fury. As I turned onto my street, I felt the strange, sickening pit in my stomach. The neighborhood looked different. The air felt different. The familiar silhouette of the redwood was missing from the skyline. I pulled into my driveway and ran to the backyard. I stopped dead in my tracks. My knees almost gave out.
The scene was devastating, far worse than the camera footage had conveyed. The redwood was gone. The massive trunk, easily 10 feet in diameter, lay horizontally across the lawn like a fallen colossus. Sawdust covered everything like a layer of toxic snow. Branches were scattered everywhere, a debris field that extended into the neighboring yards. The smell of fresh-cut wood, usually so pleasant, was overwhelming, sickening. It was a massacre. And there, standing proudly next to the massive stump, was Brenda. She was on her phone, laughing, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. "Yes, it's finally done," she was saying to someone, likely one of her HOA cronies. "The eyesore is gone. My roses will finally get the sunlight they deserve. It was expensive, yes, but worth every penny to restore order." She noticed me standing there, paralyzed. Her face broke into a smug, triumphant smile, a look of pure victory. "Ah, Mark, you're back," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "See, I told you I'd take action. You can thank me later for improving your property value. I'll be sending you the invoice for the labor, of course. It was $15,000. I expect payment by the end of the month, or we will initiate the lien process immediately." My blood boiled. The rage was so intense, it was blinding. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tackle her, to drag her off my property, to make her feel the pain and the violation she had inflicted on me. But I remembered the security footage. I remembered the law. I knew that reacting with anger now, losing control, would only jeopardize my case. It would allow her to paint me as unstable, aggressive. I needed to be smart. I needed to be cold. I needed to be calculating. I didn't say a single word to her. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms, took a deep breath, and pulled out my phone. I started recording a video. I recorded her standing over the stump, her admission of guilt, her demand for payment echoing in the air. I recorded the damage, the debris field, the sheer scale of the destruction. I walked the entire perimeter, documenting every detail. I walked silently past her and into my house. "What's the matter, Mark?" she taunted from the yard, her voice following me. "Cat got your tongue? Next time, listen to your president." She didn't know that my silence was not a sign of defeat. It was the calm before the storm. I wasn't calling the police, not yet. I was calling the most specialized arborist in the state and the most ruthless property lawyer money could buy. Before we dive into the legal ramifications and how we calculated the true, devastating cost of Brenda's arrogance, if you're enjoying the story of justice, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Keys and Chaos. We bring you stories like this every week, exposing the entitlement and the chaos that follows. You don't want to miss what happens next because Brenda's world is about to come crashing down harder than my tree. For the next 72 hours, Brenda paraded around the neighborhood like a conquering hero. She hosted an impromptu cocktail party in her backyard, celebrating the neighborhood improvement project. I could hear the clinking of glasses and the laughter from my kitchen window. She thought she had won. She thought I was broken, too intimidated to fight back. She fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of when defending my legacy. While she was celebrating, I was plotting. The storm was brewing, and it was going to be a Category 5 hurricane aimed directly at her pristine, artificial existence. My first call was to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a certified master arborist specializing in heritage trees and forensic arboriculture. She was the best in the business, a renowned expert, often called as an expert witness in high-stakes property disputes. I explained the situation, the age of the tree, and its protected status. She agreed to come out immediately, clearing her schedule. Dr. Reed arrived the next morning. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with an encyclopedic knowledge of dendrology and a palpable respect for ancient trees. When she saw the scene in my backyard, her professional demeanor cracked. She let out a low, mournful whistle. "My God," she whispered, walking the length of the fallen giant, her hand resting gently on the bark. "They actually did it. The arrogance." She spent the next 12 hours documenting everything. It was a meticulous forensic process. She measured the diameter of the stump, 10 feet, 4 inches precisely. She took multiple core samples from the trunk to verify the age, confirming it was, indeed, over 250 years old. She confirmed a species, Sequoia sempervirens. She meticulously documented the health of the tree prior to the felling, using the samples and the remaining foliage to prove it was pristine, healthy, and structurally sound, refuting Brenda's claims that it was a danger. She photographed the sawdust, the debris field, the extensive damage to the surrounding landscape, the crushed fence, the disturbed soil. She even documented the angle of the cuts, proving it was a deliberate, professional felling, albeit a reckless one. While Dr. Reed was working, my lawyer arrived. His name was Richard Rick Thorne, and he specialized in property law, specifically something known as timber trespass, or more colloquially, tree law. Rick was known throughout the state for being aggressive, meticulous, and terrifyingly effective. He had secured some of the largest judgments in the state's history regarding tree destruction. When Rick saw the backyard, he didn't show emotion. He didn't gasp like Dr. Reed. He just started calculating, a cold, focused look in his eyes. A few days later, Dr. Reed's report came back. It was 200 pages long, filled with data, photographs, analysis, and valuation methodology. Rick sat me down in his office. He had a terrifying grin on his face, the kind a shark makes before it attacks. "Mark," Rick said, sliding the report across his massive mahogany desk, "Brenda made a mistake. A colossal, life-altering mistake. She thought she was cutting down a nuisance. She actually destroyed an irreplaceable asset, and she did it in the most negligent way possible." He started breaking down the valuation. First, we have the base value of the tree itself. In the world of landscaping and property law, a mature, healthy coastal redwood of this size and age is essentially irreplaceable. You can't just go to a nursery and buy a 250-year-old tree. To attempt to calculate its value, we use the industry standard. He pointed to a section in Dr. Reed's report. Dr. Reed used the trunk formula method, which considers the species, size, condition, and location. Based on these factors, the base appraised value of the redwood was $350,000. I gasped. I knew it was valuable, but $350,000 was more than the value of many houses in the neighborhood. "That's just the beginning," Rick chuckled, leaning back in his chair, enjoying the moment. "Brenda hasn't even begun to pay." He continued, "In our state, we have very specific, very punitive statutes regarding timber trespass. If someone intentionally and maliciously cuts down a tree on your land, which she admitted to doing on camera, thank you very much for recording that, the court awards mandatory treble damages." "Treble?" I asked, the word catching in my throat. "Triple," Rick said, his grin widening. 3 times the base value. That brings the damages for the tree alone to $1,050,000. I was stunned. The number was astronomical. We had crossed the $1 million threshold. "But wait, there's more," Rick said, pulling out a calculator. He was clearly relishing this. The redwood wasn't just standing there looking pretty. It was providing significant ecological services. Most importantly, its massive root system was stabilizing the soil on the slope behind your house. Now that it's gone, you have a significant immediate erosion risk. He pulled out another report, this one from a geotechnical engineer I had hired at his recommendation. The report was filled with complex diagrams and alarming conclusions. To mitigate the erosion risk and stabilize the slope, preventing potential landslides that could threaten your foundation, you need to build a substantial structural retaining wall and install a complex drainage system. The estimated cost for that engineering and construction work is $250,000. We were now at $1.3 million. Then we have the cleanup costs, Rick continued. She left a 150-foot log and a massive debris field in your backyard. Removing that requires specialized equipment, cranes, and labor. That's another $40,000. $1.34 million. And then there are the legal fees, Rick said, pointing to himself. My fees, Dr. Reed's fees, the engineer's fees. That's another $60,000 easily. $1.4 million. Finally, Rick said, closing the file and looking me dead in the eye, we have punitive damages. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a willful, malicious act of vandalism. She trespassed. She violated the very HOA covenants she was supposed to enforce. She ignored your explicit warnings. She destroyed a designated historical landmark. We are seeking an additional $100,000 in punitive damages to punish her and deter others from ever attempting something this egregious again. The grand total? $1.5 million. She doesn't have $1.5 million, I said, still trying to process the magnitude of the number.
She has a house worth nearly that much, Rick said coldly. She has assets. She has investments. She has a retirement fund. And we are going to take them all. He pulled out a thick legal binder. This is the lawsuit. We are filing it tomorrow morning. But we aren't just going to serve her papers quietly at her home. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to assert her dominance in front of the neighborhood. We are going to give her a public reckoning. The plan was set. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Sunday evening. It was the perfect venue.
Sunday evening arrived. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige building that perfectly reflected Brenda's aesthetic sensibilities. The room was packed. Brenda had been drumming up attendance, promising a major announcement about successful neighborhood beautification projects and addressing non-compliance. She was planning to use my property as an example of her effectiveness. I waited outside until the meeting was in full swing. I could hear Brenda's voice droning on through the open doors, lecturing the residents about the importance of maintaining uniformity and adhering to the covenants, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. I took a deep breath, clutched the thick legal binder in my hand, and walked into the hall. The heavy thud of the doors closing behind me made everyone turn around. The room went silent. I saw Brenda standing on the stage, behind a podium, a triumphant smile plastered on her face. "Ah, look," she sneered into the microphone, her voice echoing through the room. "It's Mark. Did you finally come to pay the invoice for the tree removal service? I believe it was $15,000. You are officially late, and the fines are accruing." The audience chuckled nervously. They knew what had happened, but they were too afraid of Brenda to speak up, caught between their fear of her and their shock at the destruction. "No, Brenda," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying across the room, cutting through the tension. "I'm not here to pay you. I'm here to pay you back." I walked straight up the center aisle, my footsteps echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. The tension in the room was electric. Every eye was on me. I walked up to the stage, climbed the steps, and stood directly in front of her. She looked confused, then annoyed by my proximity. "Get off my stage, Mark. You are disrupting the meeting. Security!" I didn't say a word. I slammed a legal binder onto the podium in front of her. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "You have been served," I announced, my voice loud enough for everyone in the back row to hear clearly. Brenda scoffed. She picked up the binder, laughing, trying to maintain her composure. "What is this nonsense? A countersuit? Are you going to sue me for improving my property? Go ahead, make my day." But as her eyes scanned the first page, the summary of the lawsuit, the laughter died in her throat. Her hands started to shake violently. Her face went pale white, contrasting sharply with the bright red of her lipstick. Her facade was crumbling in real time. She read the numbers. Her eyes widened in disbelief, then terror. $1.5 million? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper, but amplified by the microphone for the entire room to hear. "Are you insane? It was just a tree, a messy, inconvenient tree." It was a 250-year-old coastal redwood. It was a registered heritage tree, protected by state law. And because you trespassed onto my property and cut it down maliciously, you committed a felony. That figure includes mandatory treble damages under the timber trespass statute. The room gasped. The word felony changed the atmosphere instantly. The neighbors realized this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. "But that's not all," I continued, maintaining my composure, ensuring my voice was calm and steady. "This isn't just a lawsuit. It's a pre-judgment lien notice." "A lien?" Brenda whispered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for support, finding none. "Yes, Brenda," I explained calmly. "We have placed an emergency lien on your property. Until you pay the $1.5 million in damages listed in this lawsuit, your house, your cars, your bank accounts, and that precious rose garden of yours,
They technically belong to me. You cannot sell them. You cannot transfer them." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The reality of the situation was crashing down on Brenda in front of the entire community she had tried so hard to control. She panicked. She looked at the other board member sitting at the table next to her, her eyes wide with desperation. "Help me! You have to help me! The HOA will cover this, right? The D&O insurance? I did this for the neighborhood. You all supported me. You voted for this." The HOA treasurer, a timid man named David, who had always been steamrolled by Brenda, stood up immediately. He looked terrified, but resolute, finally finding his spine. "Absolutely not, Brenda," David said, his voice shaking but clear. "We reviewed the minutes. You acted unilaterally. You did not have board approval for this action. You violated our own bylaws and you broke the law. The HOA is not liable for your crimes. Our legal counsel has confirmed that our insurance will not cover intentional criminal acts." Brenda looked around the room, desperate. The neighbors, the ones who had been cheering her on just days before, were now looking away, avoiding eye contact. They realized they had been complicit in her tyranny, and they were terrified of the fallout. Brenda collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, loud, ugly sobs that echoed through the clubhouse. The mask of the impeccable HOA president shattered, revealing the insecure, entitled bully underneath. She realized in that moment that her arrogance, her obsession with control, her petty grievances over rose bushes and needles had cost her everything. I walked off the stage and out of the clubhouse, leaving Brenda alone in the spotlight, drowning in the devastating consequences of her own actions.
The aftermath was brutal and swift. The lawsuit didn't take long to resolve. The evidence was undeniable and overwhelming. We had the high-definition security footage of Brenda directing the crew. We had the video of her standing on the stump, admitting guilt and demanding payment. We had the meticulous, exhaustive reports from Dr. Reed and the geotechnical engineer. We had the historical designation of the tree. Brenda's lawyer, realizing the utter hopelessness of the situation and the potential for criminal charges if they fought it, strongly advised her to settle. They offered $500,000. We refused. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that this kind of egregious violation of rights never happened again in Oak Knoll. The case went to court. The judge was visibly appalled by Brenda's actions, her arrogance, and her blatant disregard for the law. He awarded the full amount, $1.5 million in damages. Brenda, of course, didn't have $1.5 million in cash lying around. She was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Her assets were liquidated in a fire sale. The house, her temple of perfection, her beige palace, was put up for auction. The very house she was trying to improve by destroying my legacy was taken from her to pay the judgment. The irony was delicious and profound. And the best part? The new owners who bought her house are wonderful people. They are artists. They love nature. They absolutely hate roses. They ripped out the chemically treated lawn and the artificial turf and planted a wildflower meadow and a vegetable garden. The backyard is now full of life and color. With the settlement money, I paid off my mortgage. I built the extensive retaining wall and drainage system, ensuring the stability of the slope for decades to come. And I started the restoration process. You can't replace a 250-year-old redwood. It's gone forever, a victim of human pettiness. But you can honor its memory. I hired Dr. Reed to oversee the planting of a grove of 30 new redwood saplings along the property line. They are fast-growing trees nurtured by the rich soil and the memory of the giant that stood before them. In a few decades, the skyline will be filled again. The legacy will continue. The neighborhood changed dramatically after Brenda left. The HOA board was dissolved and reconstituted with reasonable people, including David, the treasurer, who became the new president. The artificial turf in the common areas was ripped out and replaced with natural grass. The fines were reduced, the restrictive bylaws were repealed. The atmosphere became relaxed, friendly, human. People started talking to each other again, no longer afraid of the prying eyes of the HOA police. As for Brenda, she now lives in a small, cramped apartment complex across town, far from the exclusive enclave she once ruled. I hear it's on the ground floor, facing a concrete wall. No yard, no roses, and definitely no trees. Karma doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it takes time to calculate the damages, to gather the evidence, to build the case. But when it hits hard. Brenda thought she was above the law. She thought her aesthetic preferences superseded history, property rights, and basic human decency. She learned a $1.5 million lesson. She destroyed a giant, but in the end, she was the one who was cut down to size. Thank you for watching Keys in Chaos. We expose entitled people and the devastating consequences of their actions every single week on this channel. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate karma and satisfying justice, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the chaos. We'll see you in the next video.